Good afternoon and welcome to the Dean's Lecture Series. My name is Steve Evans and I am the Acting Dean of the Faculty of Graduate Studies at the University of Victoria. Today I have the privilege to introduce Xavier Mouy, who is a doctoral candidate in the School of Earth and Ocean Sciences. Xavier has a Master of Science in Oceanography with distinction from the University of Quebec at Rimouski and a Bachelor of Science in Acoustics, Signal Processing and Vibration from Mouy University in France. Xavier is going to talk to us today about the Fish Sound Project, unraveling the identity of fish sounds in British Columbia. Thank you all for coming.
Hi, my name is Xavier Mouy. I'm an acoustician and a PhD student at the University of Victoria in the School of Earth and Ocean Sciences. My research is supervised by Dr. Stan Dosso from CIOS and from Dr. Francis Juanes from the biology department. So here today I'm going to talk about sound that are recorded in the ocean. And since most of the people are going to watch this talk online with their computers, I would suggest to put some headphones on so you have a better experience of the sound I'm going to play and some of the subtleties of the different of the sounds. So to start this talk, I'd like to tell you two stories. The first one goes back in time in the 1980s. At the time is the Cold War. There's a lot of political tension between the Soviet Union and the rest of the world. And there's a lot of spies and submarine stories that have made some great movies. One of the stories I'm going to tell you now is about a specific event that happened in the early 1980s called Whiskey on the Rocks. And what happened there is that a Soviet submarine of the Whiskey class was spying off the coast of Sweden. And because of navigation errors, this submarine went ashore on a big rock, hence the name Whiskey on the Rocks. As you can imagine, that created a lot of political tensions, and since then, the Swedish government has put in place a lot of monitoring equipment to monitor their waters and try to detect any other potential intrusions from submarines. The way to monitor submarines, you can put hydrophones in the water, which are underwater microphones, and these can listen to the ocean. You can detect the sound from the propellers or the machinery inside the submarines, and then you can detect the presence of submarines. So, despite the Prime Minister of Sweden had warned the Soviet Union that they would not do any other intrusion in the water, otherwise there would be lots of consequences. Sweden kept hearing those sounds from those hydrophones that they thought were from Soviet submarines. And one of the sounds they were hearing is this sound. So that substantially increased political tension between the two parties. But then, several years later, some researchers got access to the data and found out that these sounds were actually not from submarines, but from this little fish, the herring. Funnily enough, the herring is making sound by releasing bubbles through the anal opening. So they're basically farting. So the bubble that are releasing in the ocean is making that ticking sound that you just heard. You multiply that by all the several thousands of fish in a school of fish, and apparently that resembles the noise of a submarine. The second story I'd like to tell you is happening in the North America on the West Coast. People that have houses on the water kept hearing a humming sound when the night was coming during the spring season. And the sound they were hearing sounded like this. People were very annoyed and had some trouble sleeping because of this. There were some conspiracy theory about like what could be the cause of that sound. Some said like it might be aliens, some secret military activities. But again, here, after some years of research, scientists found that it was actually a fish humming, a fish making sound to attract females. And that specific fish was the plainfin midshipman. So that species of fish is spending most of the year in deep waters, but then it's time to reproduce, goes back into shallow waters and produces this sound to attract the females. But this time, the plain-fin midshipman is not releasing bubbles. It's using the swim bladder. And this fish has some specific muscles that are wrapped around the swim bladder that can contract very fast. So by contracting the muscles on the swim bladder, that makes this humming sound that you heard previously. And these are not the only fish that make sound. For example, the catfish is moving their bones together to make this squeaking sound. Or the seahorse. The seahorse is moving the bones of its skull and clicking them together to make this sound. Finally, the parrotfish is eating corals. And while it's eating, you can hear this crunching sound in the water. So since we can hear fish in the ocean, why don't we use this information to monitor them for science, for marine conservation or fisheries management? We could just put hydrophones in the water and just listen. We can listen for a long time and it's totally non-intrusive. We're not bothering any of the species in the ocean. So now if we look at the other methods that are available to monitor fish. First you have trawling. So you have nets that you tow behind a boat and then you collect fish. You can identify the species, you can count them, you can size them, you can even take samples from them. It's very useful for science, but it has on the bad side, it can be intrusive because you're obviously killing the animals you're catching, and also very costly. If you want to be less intrusive, you can have divers do dive surveys. You can still have access to the fish. You can count them and identify them, but you have a much more restricted set of measurements that you can take. It's also limited to shallow water. If you want to go deeper, we have underwater robots like the remote operated vehicles that you can drive in the deep ocean. And it's nice, you can see areas that are not accessible by humans, but then you have some noise from the machine that can disrupt the animals you're looking at, and it's also expensive. If you want to be completely quiet, you can have underwater cameras. With this, you can see the fish, and for very long times, if the camera is connected to shore. The problem is that you rely on the visibility, and also if you go deep, you'll need external light, and those lights can disrupt the fish that you are monitoring. Another method is fish tags. So you have little sound transmitters that you can put in the fish, and it's transmitting sound that is unique to that fish. So when the fish is swimming through a hydrophone, then you can identify this code and link it to the specific fish that you tag, so you know where that fish went and where. It is extremely useful, but it's, as you can imagine, intrusive, and you can only monitor only a small set of fish. Finally, you have active acoustics. So you're using echo sounders to look at what's underneath the ocean. You can have a look at fish density, which is extremely useful, and you can have fairly nice time series of data. The problem is that you can be restricted in your spatial coverage, and also sometimes it gets tricky to identify the fish that you see in the echogram. So in all of those methods, they're working together, and what you're trying to achieve is having long time series over large spatial coverage. So you have a good understanding of what's going on in the ocean. But what about passive acoustics? So passive acoustics is just listening in the ocean. And it's been used successfully to monitor marine mammals. I show here on this map a study that was done in the northern Alaska. All the yellow dots that you see here are acoustic recorders that were deployed on the ocean floor for a year, and they were monitoring the sound in the Chukchi Sea over the several hundreds of kilometers. The color that you see on the map are the number of calls that were produced by bowhead whales. So as it is yellow, we detected a lot of bowhead calls, and when it's blue, then there was almost no bowhead calls. So you can see that you have a good idea of where the bowheads were, and you can even define the migration corridor as the bowheads are moving from the Bering Sea to the Beaufort Sea. So you see, in that case, we have good temporal coverage and also extremely good spatial coverage. So it seemed like passive acoustic would be very useful for monitoring fish, just like we do for marine mammals. So say we want to use passive acoustic to monitor fish in British Columbia. What would it take? That would take, first, hydrophones. We need to collect sound on the water. Here on this map, you see that each of the dots are hydrophones that are deployed by different institutions along the coast. Some have been collecting data for several months, some from several years. You see that it has good coverage along the coast. There are some gaps, but it's a very good start. So now it's good. We can record in the ocean, but what are the fish doing? Can we record any fish sounds in British Columbia? We'll go through 4 locations. The first one is in northern BC, in Adagwai. So there are fish sounds in Adagwai. If you go further south, in the Great Bear Rainforest, here again, some fish sounds that are different from the others. Now in the Strait of Georgia, again, some different fish sounds. And finally here in Hornby Island, some beautiful fish sounds that are also different from the other locations. So we have fish sounds at different locations along the coast and that are different and that seem very promising. So if we look at Hornby Island, the graph that you see here is the number of fish sounds that have been detected during the summer month every day. So you see that there's not a single day where we didn't have any fish sounds. So now we have a good spatial coverage and good time coverage as well. So it seemed very promising. So there's one information though that is missing. We know that those sounds are from fish, but what fish? Which fish? We don't know exactly from which species this sound is coming from, and that's a crucial piece of information that prevents us from using passive acoustics for monitoring fish. So what can we do about this? The kind of logical way is like you take a fish, you put it in a tank, you have an hydrophone in the tank, and you just record what they say, basically. And that's great, and sometimes it works in that it has led to very important work. However, it has some drawbacks. The first one is that fish, as you can imagine, don't like to be taken out of their habitat into this tank, because that's not where they live. So sometimes, even though they can vocalize in their habitat, they would not vocalize in the tank. Another issue is that even if the fish is vocalizing in the tank, there's some propagation issues. As the fish is vocalizing, the sound is hitting each of the wall and it's bouncing, and all these interferences are combined together and are distorting the sound. So even if you have a good measurements, what you record in the spectral components of the sound might not be what you find in the wild. So that's an issue. So let's go in the wild now. You can deploy instruments on the ocean bottom. That's an example that you see here on this picture. You have an acoustic recorder that can record for several months, and it's on the bottom. So now this picture was taken from a GoPro. So you say, okay, if I hear a fish sound, then I just have to look at the image from the camera. And if I see a fish, then chances are the fish I heard is the fish I see in the camera. In that case, you see that little fish in the bottom corner. That's a black-eyed goby. So great. The sound comes from black-eyed goby. Well, if you look a bit closer, there's lots of different fish around. So how do you know which fish produce the sound? Also, there's nothing that tells you that there's a fish behind the field of view of the camera that produces the sound. So having an acoustic recorder and a video is needed, but is not enough. You need to be able to localize where the sound is coming from. So you're sure that what you see in the camera is the fish that is producing the sound. And that turns out to be my PhD research. I want to be able to collect fish sounds in the wild using video cameras, acoustic recorders, and also doing some acoustic localization. So to localize where the sound comes from in 3 dimensions. So now I added a couple of more constraints. I want the system or this method to be autonomous, so I can deploy instruments in British Columbia for several weeks at a time. And also I want the system to be portable, We see that there are different places around BC that have different types of sounds. So I want to be able to go back to those places, easily deploy the system and move on. So it involves a couple of phases. The first one, we need to have hardware that is capable of doing this, but also software to do the localization. Once we have all this figured out, then we can go in the field and do the actual measurements and build up this catalog of fish sound for British Columbia. So let's go through the different components. First is the video camera. I talked earlier about the GoPro camera. And these are nice and handy, but they only can record video for a couple of hours. So we had to come up with our own instrument. So we developed the fish cam, which is an autonomous camera that can record video for up to a couple of weeks continuously. It's made of a pack of rechargeable D-cell batteries and then some electronics based on a Raspberry Pi single board computer. The electronic has two components. One is the camera and the second one is a buzzer. And the buzzer is important because it's emitting a beep occasionally, and this beep can be heard by the hydrophones, and so you can synchronize the data from the video and from the acoustic recorder. And then since we developed this, we made this schematic open source and for other people to use. Then you put all these electronics in pressure housings. The first one is something we built from scratch from PVC pipes, which is obviously less expensive, but goes pretty shallow water, up to 30 meters. And the second pressure housing is something that we purchased from California that is a bit more expensive, but also a bit more reliable and can go up to 100 meters. So that ticks the box from the video camera that we needed. Now, the acoustic recorders. This actually was the easy part, but the most expensive, because there are some solutions that exist off the shelf. The first one that we use is an AMR-G3, which is manufactured by a company here in Victoria. And this one can record sound for up to a month with 6 hydrophones. And then we have a smaller recorder that is manufactured in New Zealand, which can record for less amount of time, so about 10 days, and has only 4 hydrophones, but it's much smaller and lighter. And we used both of those instruments in our setup. And finally, the acoustic localization. So this part actually, we know how to do. We do it every day. If you close your eyes and you just listen, you can hear like the bird in the tree or the car passing by behind you. Even though you don't see them, you're able to tell fairly precisely where those sounds come from. Another example I like to take is the one from my daughter Charlotte that you see in the picture. So Charlotte, for some reason, is obsessed with catching flies. Yet flies are small, right? And they go pretty fast. So she can't really see them and catch them. So what she does, she just close her eyes and just listen. And she can localize fairly accurately where the fly is in the room and try to catch it if she can. So it's due in part by the fact that your ears are separated by a few centimeters. And then when the sound is traveling through the air, it's coming to one ear before the other. And this small time delay can be interpreted by your brain as a location in space. So we can use the same principle in the water, except this time we're not limited to 2 ears. We can use several hydrophones, and more hydrophones the better. So here, in the diagram that you see here, you have 6 hydrophones, which are the colored dots. So when a fish is calling in the water and calling, the sound is traveling through each of those hydrophones with a slight time delay. We can measure the time delay, and we have algorithms that can localize and find the location fairly precisely in 3 dimensions. So we can play with how many hydrophones you need, where are they placed, to find how accurately you can localize. We want to know if we see a fish in the camera, we want to know if you can localize it here, but if it's plus or minus 100 meters, then it's not going to be useful, so we want to have something precise. Here, what you see in the graphic here is the uncertainty in the localization using this configuration of hydrophones. What is blue means that it's very accurate. You can localize within a few centimeters. And then when it's red, that means it's not so accurate. So we can see if the fish is inside the array of hydrophones, then you can localize it with a few centimeters. And that's what we need. We need now to add cameras, and we can identify the fish. We've done a previous preliminary study where we used this array to localize tautog in Cape Cod. And that's the localization results is what you see here as the red dot, and the black arrow crosses denote the uncertainty in the localization. So it's pretty accurate. So it seems like now we have all the ingredients. We have the video, we have the sound, and we know how to localize. So now we need to package everything up into something we can deploy in the field. So we set up 3 different instruments. There's different types of sizes for different types of habitat. Fish don't all live in the same place. Some live in like flat bottom, some live between boulders, and chances are only one set of instruments might not be able to study all of them. So there's a large array, a mini array, and a mobile array. Let's start with the large array. It's based out of PVC frame that can be disassembled and put in a car to travel easily. You can assemble everything in about an hour. And once the structure is mounted, you can put the 6 hydrophones, and there's a fish cam on the top and a fish cam on the side. Then we put this frame on the boat and deploy it. Divers can deploy it on the ocean floor and leave it for a couple of weeks, excuse me. So now when fish are swimming through the array and making sound, we can localize their sound in 3D and look at the camera. This array is very nice. It's the one that produces the localization that is the most accurate. But it has the drawback of being relatively big. It's 2 meters by 2 meters by 3 meters high. So it is nice, but not well suited for all environments. So we put another array called the mini array, which is a smaller version of it. We took the smaller recorder this time with 4 hydrophones and a single camera looking on the side. So you can be deployed this time only by 1 diver and a small inflatable boat. It can be deployed in more like slopey bottom. It's more flexible. The drawback on this system is that you cannot localize in 3 dimensions as accurately as the previous frame. However, you can still tell the bearing and elevation of where the sound is coming from. So if you have a fish right in the front of the camera, well, you can still tell if that's the one making the sound. And finally, the mobile array, which is even smaller. And this one we take the same 4 hydrophone recorder and we put on the top of an underwater drone. So this time only 1 person is needed. You take a small inflatable boat, you go in the field, deploy this small drone, and you can scoot around in rocky reefs between boulders. And when you find a good habitat and good habitat for the fish you're interested in, you can just sit on the bottom quietly, and then you have the fish coming and you can record them. As previously, you can't measure as accurately like the 3D position of the fish, but you can still tell the bearing and elevation or where the sound is coming from. So now we have everything together and we try to deploy that in the field. So we chose several sites around Victoria, and we chose those sites for different reasons. Some are because it was logistically convenient, some because that was some specific species that were living in those areas, and that's the one we wanted to record. In some other cases, as it is the case in Nanaimo, that's because some other institutions have been recording sound underwater and recording fish sounds for a very long time, for about a year. So I have a huge time series, but they don't know what fish is making those sounds. So we deployed the array there so we can identify the species and then go back to the data and have more meaningful results. So I would be lying just saying that everything went smoothly and that we built everything and that was a go, everything went well the first time. In fact, there's the 2 first deployments, which are the orange stars that you see here. Those deployments were the 2 first ones, and they didn't really work. The first one, the camera didn't work, and the second one, just the instrument was washed out by a storm. And I thought I would mention this because we tend to only report on the the successes of the research by ignoring some of the hurdles. And I think it's important to mention, especially for other grad students that might be in my case, that, and I think in research in general, that it's not always an easy path. Based on the loss of these instruments, however, that kind of made me rethought of the design, improve the design, and eventually redeployed and got good data. So now I'd like to focus on some of the data that I collected of Hornby Island. So what you see here is the view from the top camera of the large array. So it's looking down. The square that you see, the PVC square, is the bottom of the PVC frame. You have hydrophones at each of the corners and one in the middle. And what you're gonna hear, I'm gonna play the video, and also you'll hear some sounds. There will be two sequences where you can hear fish sounds. And there's quite a bit going on here, so we'll go through this a first time and kind of review the scene, and then a second time with all the localization. So let's get started. You see that at the top, in the middle of the top, you have a fish that is about 1 meter, which is a lingcod. It's sitting on the array. Now, on the bottom left, you have a quillback rockfish, which is kind of hard to see, but it's at the bottom left, and it's going up towards the rocks on the left. At the same time, you have another quillback rockfish that is coming to the bottom of the screen and towards the center of the array. Now, you can hear fish sound, and the quillback that was in the middle just swim quickly to the left and join the other quillback rockfish. And you can hear some other rockfish, some fish sound, sorry. Then the lingcod moved on the bottom and came back at the original place. In the meantime, at the bottom right, there was another quillback swimming through the array. So quite a bit going on here. And you can imagine that if we don't have localization, it's totally impossible to see which fish is producing the sound. So to review a little bit the scene, you had one fish that started in the bottom and went up. The circle that you see here are where that fish was when we heard the two sequences of sounds. We had another one that was a quillback rockfish that swam towards the center of the array, and then as the lingcod moved, swam quickly to the left and joined the other quillback rockfish. Each of the dots, again, here are where that fish was during the episode of fish sounds. And then you had the lingcod and the other rockfish at the top right. So now we can play that again, but now with all the information we have. So on the top left, you have the camera, the exact same thing that we'd just seen, but just zoomed out. On the right, you have the acoustic localization results. So the square that you see is the square that you see in the video, the bottom of the frame. Now, when we are localizing a fish sound, it's going to appear on that diagram with a red dot, and it's going to be, as previously, a cross, a black cross that will denote how accurately it was localized. Now on the bottom, you have a spectrogram, which is an image representation of the sound. So you have on the x-axis, you have time, and on the y-axis, you have frequency. And the color denotes the energy of the sound. So you see that in the middle of the spectrogram, you see some red bars, and those bars represent the first sequence of fish sound that we've heard. And then you see a set of red bars towards like the 2/3 maybe, and it's going to be the second sequence of fish sounds. So now I'm going to play the sequence again. So we have the quillback rockfish that is in the middle of the array and going to the left as the lingcod moves. We hear fish sounds and we can localize them. The location of the sounds matches with the quillback rockfish that we see in the video. And the second episode of fish sounds where the two quillback rockfish are together in the middle left. So now we can tell with certainty that the sound that we've heard is from quillback rockfish. So that's our first page of our fish sound catalog. I'll go through another example, and this one will be quicker as there are less things going on. Here you have on the central part of the array, you have probably the same link card sitting on the recorder. It's going to move and going to go away to the bottom left of the array. If you see the spectrogram, you see you have, like as previously, red bars in the second half of the spectrogram, which are fish sounds. And I'm going to play this sequence. So the link card is sitting on the recorder, and now going to the bottom left corner, and we localize the sound where the link card was. So here, that's our second page of the fish sound catalog. And neither of the sound of these species have been referenced before. So this is new information. And it is important because those fish are actually important for British Columbia. Quillback rockfish are considered as threatened by UVic. And the link cod is also considered, the stock in Strait of Georgia is labeled as cautious, as you have to be careful about this population. So those are both important species for marine conservation. So if we put back that into perspective, in British Columbia, we have 164 rockfish conservation areas along the coast, which are the yellow patches that you see on the map. And those areas are meant to protect rockfish and also link cod, to have the population bounce back. And so we don't really know if these areas are effective, though, because there are no efficient ways to monitor rockfish or link cod populations. So with the sounds that we just identified from those two species, we hope that passive acoustic monitoring will be yet another tool that we can add to the toolbox that will help monitor those two species and help marine conservation in British Columbia. If we took even a further step back, we see that we identify several pieces of the puzzle that are essential. Like we have instrumentation that can record the sound. Now we have the second piece, which is the sound from a species, and we can identify from which species the sound is coming from. There's another piece that I didn't talk about, but I am also working on, is efficient ways to process the data. So we don't have to listen to years of data, but we have some algorithm that can help us make a more efficient analysis. And those are important for marine conservation, but not quite enough. There's a critical piece of this puzzle, which is fish density. Can we estimate the number of fish in this environment just by listening? And there are good signs that it might be possible. Some studies carried out in different places of the world have shown that in some cases it is possible, but that's something we need to investigate. So hopefully it's going to be something I will be researching in the near future. With this, I'd like to thank all the people that have contributed to this project. As you've seen, there are several components, very diverse, of this project, and it takes a whole set of skills that people brought. So it really takes a village. First of all, like Francis Juanes and Stan Dosso, who have been absolutely amazing in mentoring me and supporting this project, as well as collaborators Morgan Black, Kieran Cox, and Jessica Cayley that have organized and managed all the diving operations for the field measurements. There's many also institutions that have funded this research, and I'm very grateful for. And also, I've been extremely lucky to have many people that volunteered their time to go with me in the field and collect those precious data. With this, I'd like to thank you, and I'd be happy to answer any questions if you have, so you can send me emails. I'm also on social media and post regular updates on my research. I also have a blog where I post some updates about the Fish Sound project. So I'm looking forward to hear from you. Thank you.